Okay, so the recording and the transcription should be on now. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Debbie first for hers and Nicola's presentations. Thank you.
I'm muting. Can everybody hear me? Alex can, yeah, okay, great. Well, welcome everybody. And thank you very much for attending our webinar today. What Nicola and I are hoping to do in this first presentation is to set out our analysis of the issues and why we feel this is a pressing and really under-researched problem. So I'm going to set the scene somewhat, talking about our financial experience of aging, and then I'll hand over to Nicola to cover what role the law plays in terms of our capacity in later life and what the issues might be with that. And then we'll hopefully have some time for Q&A afterwards. Sorry, has that advanced? Oh, there we go. Is that second slide, someone? Alex? Yeah, great. So the point that we start from is that populations all over the world are aging, and the over 80s are the fastest aging group. This is posing a number of societal challenges, but when we look at debates around money and later life, we really see two strands to the discussion. The first is the idea that financial education is becoming more important than ever before in our modern world. And the second is around declining cognitive function. Well, we all start off with different cognitive abilities, and if we live long enough, our cognitive abilities will decline. That's something pretty much all of us face. But the evidence on cognitive decline is very mixed and complex, as I'll show you in a moment. So if we imagine an older person, they may have been more or less financially capable to begin with. They may be suffering normal cognitive decline, or they may be on the journey to lacking mental capacity. They may live alone, or they may be embedded in a couple or in a family. These are things that begin behind the closed doors of the family. They are stigmatized and hidden. But while all of this has been going on, there's been a general move over a number of years and by governments of all colours towards individualising our finances, whether that's in housing policy, benefits, social care, savings, financial services or pensions. Piece by piece, collective protection has been replaced by purportedly giving us control of our money, individualizing risk, and leaving us to manage our finances increasingly on our own across the life course. So in other words, governments are imagining that we're a certain kind of citizen, that it's possible for each one of us to amass money, to invest it wisely, and to make optimal spending decisions over the whole of our lives. They're certainly not imagining that we might struggle with these things, or that we might suffer from cognitive decline affecting money management in our later years. So I only have a couple of minutes here. I'm going to show you two slides to illustrate how wide of the mark this point is. The first one is about what we don't know, and the second one is about how ambiguous the space around cognitive decline is. So if you were having a conversation about managing finances with an ordinary person, what are the chances of them not understanding something quite key to that conversation? Well, here's some population data from the UK, which led the Money Advice Service to conclude that there is much work to be done to improve UK financial capability. You can see how critical some of this stuff is. Only 78% of people can read the balance on a bank statement, which means effectively that 22% of the population are functionally innumerate. Just 60% realise that if inflation is 5% and interest is 3%, then buying power is reduced. And only 64% can calculate the balance at the end of the year if £100 is paid into a savings account at a guaranteed 2% per annum. So, okay, we're not that financially capable, but what about the issue of cognitive decline? So one of the leading researchers in this field is a person called Daniel Marson, and he thinks that in terms of understanding financial competency, there are 8 different domains in which people can be judged. You don't need to absorb what these are, don't worry about that. But just to note that within these domains, there are simple decisions and there are complex decisions requiring higher order functioning. So for example, being able to recognize and count coins is a simple skill, defining and applying financial concepts is complex, and so on. Well, Marston conducted the first studies to empirically investigate the loss of financial capacity in people living with Alzheimer's disease. And I'll now show you some of what he found. So these are some results from one of Marston's studies about cognitive decline associated with mild and moderate Alzheimer's disease. Using his scales, he classified people as capable, marginally capable, and incapable on financial capacity. And yes, we see clear trends and patterns in this table, all in the expected directions, with increasing incapacity in these important domains as the disease advances. But the main point I want you to take away from this today is not that. It's about variation. Remembering that these are all people diagnosed with dementia, if we look at people here with mild dementia and how they perform on these complex measures of financial concepts, we can say that about half are capable, there are a few on the margins, and the rest are not. If we look at the very important domain of financial judgment among people with mild dementia, we see that Marston's research suggests that half lack capacity on the right, 50, about 40% are on the margins, but there are still a sizable minority, 13%, who are capable in these domains. So we have this very substantial variation in capability, especially in the earlier stages of the disease. So I think there are a number of issues that we need to think about. First, there is a need to manage money through the whole of our life course. Second, people were never very financially capable to begin with, and this is not the preserve of old people. And the third is that of declining capacity. Now, this is not something that happens to you overnight, and assessments and diagnoses about cognitive function are usually made long after, often years after, people and their families themselves notice problems. You'll be absolutely familiar with that issue from your own family experience. And with that, I'll hand you over to Nicola to think about whether the law is fit for purpose. So Nicola, if you just tell me when to advance.
I was going to say that. I'll just thank you. Okay, thank you very much. So as we've heard already today, in terms of management of money and how we go about doing these things is becoming increasingly difficult. We've lost the slide. There we go. Aging population and increasing numbers of people really reaching the late life sphere. And of course, also the government is certainly moving us towards being very much in control of our own personal financial management. But in terms of the law, it does leave us with two overarching questions that we need to ask. What role does the law currently have? What role of the law should there be in the future? And also, of course, for our interest is whether it's fit for purpose. Is it doing the job it needs to do? And there are some key questions that come through from this. One of which we know, certainly in the legal sphere, is that the mental capacity test under the Mental Capacity Act 2005 is complex. It doesn't quite work as the way we want it to. There's plenty of room for discretion and certainly interpretation. One thing that is very clear, however, is that there isn't any recognition that financial capacity is a separate issue. It's a connected issue, but it's something that potentially should be seen as a separate issue as well. There isn't really very much guidance in terms of helping those people who make those assessments about how to deal with financial capacity. There isn't any acknowledgement beyond the fact that finances may require some consideration. There are inadequacies in the way in which we can use mechanisms to anticipate incapacity. So we will briefly look at those, but they don't necessarily solve the problem. And then the final question that springs to mind, and we need to think about this a bit more, though not today, is the question of financial abuse and how we overcome that particular concern. If you can click for me, Debbie. Okay, so mental capacity, then, how do we assess it? The test is listed there for you. And just to give you an idea, these are the sort of the primary questions that are asked. Is, can a person make a decision for themselves? in relation to the matter at hand, in this case, a financial decision. Does a person have the temporary or permanent impairment or disturbance affecting the way in which one would think or the function of the brain? And is the person unable to decide because of that impairment or disturbance? In the event that these questions are asked and we come back with concerns, then the best interest test would step in, and the Mental Capacity Act would focus on the protective sort of steps to try and ensure people are protected and looked after. But how is financial capacity identified and perceived within the legal test? Sorry, if you can go back, Debbie, quickly. The test under the Mental Capacity Act is broad. It's open to interpretation, like I say. And if there are concerns and that there are questions about somebody's incapacity, then as I say, the protective framework will step in. The Act is about encouraging the facilitation of people making decisions, and when not able to do so, as I say, will protect them. The management of money is something that is very much part of this, but the law isn't necessarily at the moment that focused on it. And we tend to see the law being much more interested on questions around inability to make medical treatment decisions, social care decisions, and so on. So looking at the lack of formal legal guidance, you will see, if you look at the Mental Capacity Act, if you look at the Code of Practice that goes side by side, that is largely silent on the issue of financial capacity, and it doesn't really recognise financial capacity as a separate issue. We know that the loss of financial awareness or functioning can often be an early sign of cognitive decline and the onset of dementia. The mental capacity test in the Mental Capacity Act isn't necessarily that nuanced. It doesn't necessarily recognise this. So these early signs may not, in fact, trigger the capacity assessment in the first place. The result of this, of course, will leave some people not having legal safeguarding measures in place. They might find that informal, unregulated decisions are made for them by informal proxies, or equally, people won't be getting the support they need, and how can they access it? So without this guidance, it very much means that some people simply not get the protection that they need, or decisions will be made without any oversight. If you can click for me, please. So in terms of anticipating capacity, of course, we'd all like to think we'd be doing that. Unfortunately, we don't all do that, but there are a number of ways that can be used to try and ensure that some form of anticipation takes place. And I just want to briefly look at lasting powers of attorney, which I've circled above there. Of course, that is one way that most of us will know more of as a means of providing that, that protection for the future in the event that we might need it. But there are problems with that, of course. The individual needs to have capacity in the first place to be able to set up an LPA, a lasting power of attorney. That might not always be possible. We often hope that if somebody is diagnosed with dementia, that they will then, of course, ensure that these steps taken. However, that's not necessarily always the case. There needs to be knowledge about lasting power of attorney. And of course, you have to pay to register. So there are all sorts of things that might get in the way of the use of LPAs in the future and for people. It is a clunky mechanism. It doesn't necessarily, as I say, take account of the needs of people in these circumstances. And of course, the other thing we need to recognise is it's not necessarily one person who will be making these decisions, but also most people will find that they are provided with care and support informally through the family, as a group of people working together. So although it's there, it's not ideal for everybody's needs. So final slide then. Is the law fit for purpose in the financial capacity context? The Mental Capacity Act, on the one hand, does encourage informality of decision making, as this offers, of course, a much better way for many people in terms of offering more flexibility. It's more family friendly. Family-led decision-making processes are encouraged. But the legal framework does not recognise or offer any response to that gap that we've seen which is filled with people who have not been formally identified as legally incapacitated, but they do exhibit behaviours that suggest they may be facing difficulties. And within the financial capacity context, this is often where we start to see concerns and questions being asked. The law is currently focused largely on medical treatment decisions and other social care decisions, but not necessarily on the financial aspect of life. The financial decision-making process and concerns over a person's ability to make decisions in this context is notably absent. There's no obvious legal tools in place for families facing day-to-day issues with elderly relatives who might have challenges with money or their financial functioning. And we just stick to time.
Thank you very much, Debbie and Nicola. I'm going to do a brief presentation now on a study that we've been doing that's looking at some of these issues in more detail. I will just share my slides. Okay, so hopefully they're all clear. You can see those. Super. Okay. So I'm going to present some emerging findings from a study that myself, Debbie, Nicola, and our colleague Christina, who unfortunately can't be here today, have been working on. So this is a study that's funded by the NIHR for 18 months. We started in April last year, so we finish at the end of September. I'd also just like to acknowledge our public advisory group, some of whom I know are here today, for their really thoughtful input and feedback on the project as we've been going along, and for their warm words of support and encouragement. So I don't need to spend too long on the background to the study. Debbie has set the scene at the beginning of the session today by describing the individualisation of finances and the increasingly complex financial decisions that people are expected to make. And Nicola has just drawn attention to the legal landscape and the potential challenges in applying law around mental capacity in the context of finances. And we know that across the population as a whole, people are not particularly good at managing money, or skill levels may be highly variable. And in the UK particularly, adult numeracy levels are quite poor. There was some work published by National Numeracy 2-3 years ago that found that around half of the working age population has the numeracy skills of a primary school child. And Debbie's also outlined some challenges relating to cognitive decline. Nicola's mentioned that identification of financial abuse is not straightforward. So Debbie mentioned the work of the psychologist Daniel Marson and the different domains of financial competence. So what I'm trying to show here is the range of skills, abilities and decisions that are involved in managing money in later life. So these include making day-to-day transactions, understanding bills and paperwork, the increasing presence of technology and digitalisation of finance, which does raise the potential for further exclusion of older people. Vigilance to scams, major decisions associated with later life, such as moving into retirement, considerations around pensions, that sort of thing, and financial legal considerations like power of attorney and wills. So in our project, we've been looking at the information that is publicly available in this area. So we've looked at information that you might look for as a member of the public, faced with challenges in possible declining capacity or challenges in managing money. And we've also looked at some documents that relate to professional practice, practice guidance, code of conduct, those kind of things. We're also interested in the perspectives and experiences of managing money in later life and the support that's available for people to do this. So we've mainly focused on professionals within the Greater Manchester area, across the spectrum of what we might very broadly think of as the social care system. So not everyone we've spoke to would necessarily identify themselves as a social care professional, but essentially we've spoken to people who are working in non-health service roles who support older adults and families. So this includes people like social workers, debt, welfare and benefits advisors, community support teams, people working for charity, third sector organisations, housing providers, domiciliary care, those kind of roles. We've also interviewed a smaller number of older adults or family members with experience of supporting an older relative to manage money. We are still interested in speaking to more people, so we hope that we will have a few more interviews to come over the summer. And we're then trying to bring it all together to look at what we know from the publicly available information and from what people have told us in these interviews about their experiences. So we want to share today some emerging findings from the study, and I'm going to share three main themes or groups of findings. These are emerging findings, so we will be refining these over the next few months. And as Debbie said at the beginning, we're not offering any solutions today, but hopefully these findings present some food for thought. So the first area I want to talk about is the identification of need for support in this area. The ways in which problems with managing money are identified are complex, they're often indirect and informal, but there tend to be a range of signs that may come together to create a picture of somebody's functional ability. So we've heard a lot of examples from professionals of what may be known colloquially as the doorstep test, in which a home visit turns out to be really quite revealing about someone's general level of functioning. People often pointed to signs like piles of unopened letters as a key sign that somebody may be having difficulties in managing money. Family members also told us about some signs they'd noticed with their relatives. For example, people may start to need help to renew their car insurance or home insurance, etc., which may of course be perfectly harmless, but may in hindsight turn out to be an early sign of subsequent decline in ability to manage money. One of the questions we're posing there in the middle point is that given that home visits or seeing signs in person is extremely important, particularly around things like paperwork, this may be increasingly challenged by the digital by default moves within finance, and also by COVID, where it's not been possible for people to get into people's houses at certain points. As Debbie said earlier, by the time some professionals may be involved in spotting these signs, somebody could have been struggling for years with managing money. So if all the food in the fridge is mouldy, the house is dirty, if the person looks unkempt, this may prompt a professional to make a referral to social services for further assessment. Most professionals told us how they were not qualified to make formal assessments of mental capacity. And the quote here at the bottom about Cinderella is from one professional who felt that they saw capacity assessments much more frequently for other topics, such as changes in accommodation, than they did specifically around finances. So the question to them posed, if this is true, why might this be the case? So the second theme really tries to capture the extent to which the support that is available for people may be adequate, appropriate, and useful. It's probably the least well developed of the themes we have so far, so we just want to highlight a couple of areas that we're thinking about. So it's been quite hard for us to see where the practical help for people may be. The majority of professionals we spoke to told us that it would essentially signpost people to other services, particularly social services, or other organisations for support to manage money, or give them information. So there is support for the bureaucratic nature of managing money, for example, filling out claim forms for benefits, setting up direct debits, etc., which organisations like local authorities can do to support their clients. And there are services such as befriending services that may support somebody to go shopping. So, for example, if a family member holds power of attorney, they can set up a kitty, the befriender may use that money to go shopping and leave receipts. But there was very much the sense that people were reluctant to support someone with the day-to-day management of money and didn't really see this as part of their role. So this then places the onus on family members, or as a last resort, the local authority can act, but there may be long waiting lists for these services. So I think there are real concerns about people who may fall through the gaps and don't get support. And while safeguarding referrals are certainly a useful option, again, by the time we get to this point, somebody could have been having problems managing money for a long time. Now, there was a sense from several participants that giving people information to make decisions themselves is very much in keeping with a general ethos of empowerment and strengths-based or asset-based approaches to care. But some professionals express concerns about this within the context of finances. Given the complexities of financial systems, I think the benefits system is well known to be extremely complex to negotiate. They suggested that most people would struggle to navigate these systems, let alone somebody where mental capacity may be a concern. So one of the questions we're sort of thinking about at the moment is how appropriate is this ethos of empowerment in the context of finances, particularly given some of the issues that we've highlighted earlier. So if it's suggested to people that they seek professional advice, for example, from a legal professional or financial advisor, this of course will cost money. And people talked about setting up power of attorney with the help of a solicitor to make sure everything was watertight, but solicitors will charge several £100s for doing this. Now, it is possible to do this yourself, but you need to be comfortable completing paperwork or trying to find free legal advice. So I think there's an equity issue here, and I wonder whether this gets lost a little bit in a landscape which is essentially about providing people with information or telling them to seek information and expecting to make independent decisions. It's really important to stress that none of what I've just said here is meant to be a criticism of any of the people that we spoke with, but I do think it raises some interesting questions around who should we expect to be able to support people with money management, how far that support should go. And as more than one person said to us, there is of course a duty for banks to do more to support their customers. So the final thing that I want to put to you is the extent to which there is awareness of the personal and emotive aspects to managing money. So across the over 60 public resources that we looked at, the majority of guidance and advice is very process driven, particularly around power of attorney. It's sort of explaining what it is and talking about how to set it up. And I don't think it really conveys the emotional complexities involved for the person who may be experiencing difficulty managing their money, for the family member who starts to provide support, or for professionals working with older people. It talks a lot about setting up power of attorney, but it presents this as if it's a very linear process and says that once it's registered, it's all taken care of. And the way that power of attorney is framed is often around this message of it's there if we need it, or if it's there when we need it. And we think this is particularly interesting. So on the one hand, it may actually be a way to sort of soften the blow in a way for somebody considering granting power of attorney. In that it's reassuring that they're not giving up control and it's just there. It's there if we need it or when we need it. We don't want to imagine ourselves as being in a position where we lack the capacity to manage money. So we position this very much as a safety net for some point in the future that we don't really want to think about very much. So I think this is potentially helpful if it helps people to have conversations about the topic. It's a way into negotiating a difficult conversation with people and gives a sense of reassurance. But I would also suggest that this framing underplays the potential for complexity because it suggests a number of things as maybe being set in stone when actually they aren't. So it suggests that there will be a clearly identifiable moment when we can't manage money, that this will be agreed upon by everybody around us. And that the wishes we make now will not change, and that it will be straightforward to use power of attorney. But we have evidence that this is not always the case. People can become suspicious of their relatives. They can be in total denial that there's any problem. They can refuse to allow relatives to support them. Relatives, of course, can misuse their position of holding power of attorney. And just because somebody assumes the role of attorney does not necessarily mean that they'll be comfortable in doing so. We also heard some stories about challenges in using power of attorney with organisations like banks and utility companies. As one family member told us, a bit more empathy from some of these institutions would be nice, and the burden of managing somebody's money can be practically and emotionally draining. It was striking how little training there seems to be for the professionals we spoke to about how to have conversations with people who may be struggling to manage money. A lot seems to depend on the personal qualities and skills of the professional. There seems to be very little, even by way of more general training, like having difficult conversations with people. So we have a scenario where professionals may be in contact with people who appear to be having problems with managing their money. But then there's very little training about how to navigate conversations around this delicate issue and what to do, even if there's a referral and then afterwards the person is still working with the person. So the final point here about profoundly negative experiences, I think, is also really interesting. So one example we received was from somebody working for an LGBT organisation who talked about older members of the community remembering discrimination they may have experienced around HIV status back in the 1980s from financial institutions. And clearly there will be people who've experienced different discrimination of different kinds, such as racial discrimination and a sense of being othered by financial institutions. I think these things can live very long in people's memories, and they may greatly affect their expectations, their willingness to seek help, and to open themselves up to the stigma of having to admit that they're having difficulty managing money. So I think, again, this challenges the position of simply providing people with information, signposting people to other services, or suggesting that they seek more qualified advice. So what we're trying to do at the moment is to bring all this together. We think all three of these broad themes are connected, but we need to do some work on unpicking this and looking more at the nuances. And as I said, again, none of what I've presented today is intended to be critical of any of the people that we've spoken to. There are a lot of professionals working in really challenging roles, and I'm not saying that I'm expecting any one of those people to be doing more. So I don't think we're offering any solutions today, but hopefully that is some food for thought. So I will leave that there, and I will now hand over to Sophia from the International Longevity Centre, who is going to present their project around consumer challenges faced by people with dementia, which may have a little bit more of a solution focus in it.
Thank you, Alex. Actually, really interesting presentation so far that really resonate with some of our findings. So it was really interesting to hear kind of those kind of points. So yeah, today, so I'm Sophia, Senior Economist at ILC, and I'm just going to talk about a year-long project that we're doing at the moment, called Enabling and Protecting Consumers with Dementia, and essentially considers the consumer-related challenges that they face. So this is mainly a qual project, spoken to over 40 people living with dementia, carers and professionals from various sectors. So it's quite a broad project, which comes with positives and negatives, I think. But kind of cross retail, finance, leisure, travel, and even housing with care. So really kind of holistic view of what the challenges they're facing. And there are two key kind of reasons for us to kind of look at this. Mainly predominantly is the impact on health and well-being. If people aren't able to kind of live independently, do the kind of vital activities that they did previously before having dementia, we know that has significant effects and significantly deteriorates symptoms of dementia, which this research actually found, actually reinforced. And just kind of big picture, kind of in terms of the importance of these activities for people, what we're finding is particularly strong importance of going shopping in person. So we'll see that, while online shopping might help some people, I think shopping in person is particularly vital for health and well-being, and also getting to places. So that lack of independence then affects everything. And, if someone is not able to drive any longer or kind of get to places, so those two are really key factors. Doing leisure activities that people previously did are also important. Managing finances essentially can cause considerable distress if people, if there are issues with that. While there are quite a number of people spoke who did seem fine to no longer manage their finances as long as they weren't doing it previously. So essentially kind of depends on what someone was doing earlier. But generally we are finding across these interviews that actively trying to stay active and retain independence really helps people to live well. So there's real importance in kind of supporting independence. So what we've done is taken these challenges, and I'll talk about these in a second, and then we had an innovation forum on Monday thinking about policy, practice and product solutions. Today I will just talk about the challenges, and you can listen to the solutions later on when we present our report, just because we'll have time to kind of go through those challenges. So first kind of key point is getting to places. So key kind of challenges are struggling to get on and off the correct mode of transport. So that might be getting on the correct bus and getting off at the right stop. We also see that taxis can really help people with dementia to get to places, but even then we're seeing that some people are struggling to get the right taxi, so that's quite an issue. We're seeing particular problems as well with longer distance travel, though I think routine navigation is more important. Traveling to routine places is most important. There we are seeing challenges getting on the train, but changing trains causes particular anxiety, especially on familiar stations. And again, delays, unexpected journey changes. We're seeing that when people are taking planes or trains, and that can cause significant anxiety. We're also seeing struggling to navigate in kind of local places. That's walking, cycling and driving. This can actually be very dangerous. People getting lost, potentially being picked up by the police, maybe driving the wrong side of the road or cycling on the motorway. These are some examples that we heard. So obviously this can cause immense distress in those situations. A key issue as well is not being able to articulate. People might struggle to articulate where they are if they get lost. So where they're heading to, where home is. They may struggle to understand and verbalize this, which can create significant issues. And we are seeing that, I probably heard about tracking devices, that does help some people to kind of stay safe in these situations, but others do find this very stigmatizing, refuse to wear these. Also, some people may forget to actually use them, forget that they have these. So there's definitely, a need to build on that kind of solution. It's certainly got issues, also battery life and things like that. So It's definitely not a kind of full solution at the moment. And of course, there's human rights issues with this as well, a huge debate there. In terms of longer distance travel, it's worth noting that there are kind of very good passenger assistance services and things like that. But what we are seeing is that very few people with dementia and non-visible disabilities actually aware of this and use them. So there might be a huge scope to actually, huge potential to actually raise awareness of the support that's out there. The second key kind of topic is around buying and buying the kind of goods and services that people want and need. So we're finding significant issues around this. So just talking about shopping in person, we're finding particular issues around people forgetting what they came in for, buying multiple items. It could be multiple vitamin packs or bread that wouldn't fit in kind of the kitchen, they don't need. And to give an example, there's one you can see the quote on the right. Also somebody was mentioned that they bought cat food but they don't have a cat. So lots of examples of this, and struggling to choose between products. So lots of choice, and this can have significant implications, and many carers will then kind of almost just shop on behalf of their loved one, and that restricts independence. And we are seeing some kind of informal solutions, so for instance, carers and staff at the till asking questions to help people, but there's no kind of formal solution for this in place at the moment. We're also seeing some issues shopping online. Now, of course, you probably expect there are not as many people shopping online as in person. I think most people prefer shopping in person, but for some people, particularly with early onset dementia, we are seeing shopping online, finding this particularly useful with big shops, and especially if they struggle with a kind of rushed environment in a kind of when shopping. But there are two key issues. Again, we've seen that issue of impulsive spending, and some people are struggling in terms of overspending, maybe going to the overdraft, and actually might voluntarily try to restrict or kind of make their own solutions in terms of restricting the spending online, which was quite interesting. And a lot of barriers to use, kind of lack of confidence, that struggling with choice, the number of options, finding overstimulating, reading barriers, design issues. So there's a lot more that can be done to make this format more inclusive. And we are seeing that carers often really support their loved ones to shop online, but it also can often curb their freedom to shop online because of that first point. So there's still kind of, supporting people's independence. There's still a lot more we can do. In terms of buying financial products, we're also seeing this issue that people aren't buying necessarily what they want and need. So it might be multiple gas and electricity policies, paying for a charity multiple times a month, and maybe that's due to kind of forgetting kind of what's already in place, or kind of getting car insurance if they don't have a car, or forgetting to kind of stop paying for that car insurance. Also seeing significant issues around making risky and wise investments. So there are some types of dementia linked to risk-taking behaviour. We saw that in one or two interviews as well. And the key issues as well is struggling to get the best deal. A lot of people dementia I spoke to were saying, they find it very overwhelming, difficult to compare quotes. They kind of wish that was kind of done for them, and they know they're probably not getting the best deal, but find it too overwhelming to do this. Now we'll talk about LPA in a second, but it's really interesting that many of these issues often occur when someone hasn't put in place or actually enacted the lasting power of attorney. So it seems that's a significant issue. That was interesting what Nicola was saying earlier. And now I'll move on to kind of making payments. There are a couple of key challenges there. So firstly, at the till, I won't bore you with the kind of, you probably already know, the issues around using cash and forgetting PINs. That there are obviously significant issues. I think with cash, there's a lot of trust at the till in terms of, and even potentially taking out cash and kind of post offices and things like that. There's a lot of trust, and people are asking staff to input their PINs for them, which could be a little bit risky. But what we are seeing, which is quite interesting, actually feeling rushed is a key issue with both of these as well. So it's not necessarily just those issues in and of itself, but feeling rushed and making payments that obviously is affected by staff, customer service and people's reactions. But what is interesting is that contactless, actually, those who do use contactless do seem to find it quite useful, feel less rushed, and find it can retain their independence. So essentially, we saw almost unanimous support for it among those that do use it. But there are some still key issues. People are worried about forgetting their PIN if they have to use it in other areas. So that's some people with dementia really worried about that. So that kind of inconsistency of whether you need to remember your PIN or not is really important, because only regular use can help retain that knowledge. And many still need to remember because of the signal threshold. So that's also an issue, and they may write it down, which can obviously be risky. Other key issues are forgetting purse or wallet, which can actually be quite traumatic, lead to some incidences at the till. And forgetting to pay is actually surprisingly quite common. So that we did hear a number of times, and particularly with self-service technologies, that's becoming more common, and that's what professionals are noticing. And obviously it's the way the response to this, it can be very traumatic if people are assumed to be stealing rather than actually needing support. And actually having a doctor's note or something like that in that situation can really help to retain people's confidence if they can show that to staff to say, you know, I wasn't stealing, this is something that some of us struggle with. So yeah, that can be very traumatic for people. Now moving on to making payments. So a number of key issues in terms of online banking. Firstly is that kind of lack of confidence to use it in the first place. Interestingly, 1 or 2 people were saying they really wanted to use it, they think they'd find it useful, but they didn't feel they had any support to actually set it up. One person said, I asked my family to help me set it up, but they weren't giving me the support because they didn't think I could use it. So there's definitely some issues there. For others, it's a real reluctance in and of itself. Secondly, obviously forgetting passwords, and that can cause real significant issues, of course, in terms of accessing accounts. It can be in emergencies and things like that. And we're also seeing a number of risks with online banking. You know, people may be persuaded to give their details. I'll talk about scams in a second. So I think there's an issue with how can we maintain people's freedom but protect against risks, because there are risks to online banking. And some people actually voluntarily give up their online banking account when they've actually been scammed or have made risky investments. So how can we maintain that freedom? In terms of keeping track of finances, 2 really key issues. Essentially not realizing, essentially what we're seeing is that people with dementia sometimes don't realize they're in debt or have been scammed. And it's on the kind of, we're seeing that being discovered by their carer or the bank themselves. So are there ways that we can help them to keep track of the finances? If there is no carer and no support there, you know, that could be making them extremely vulnerable in that situation. Secondly, missing bill payments. We know that's an issue. It can often happen far before diagnosis. We are seeing that, yeah, for many people we spoke to, lack of understanding, feeling overwhelmed to consume the letters or missing letters are key issues. There's too much information. But what we are seeing is that those that use direct debits are actually finding this quite easy. So if those people that have direct debits in place are actually really kind of navigating that second challenge quite well. Next key issue is avoiding scams that can happen over the phone, very common over the phone. Postal subscriptions, and kind of less common is like at the door and online scams. Well, I don't know how common, just in those interviews, it seemed that the first 2 were particularly common. People might be bombarded with calls in kind of postal subscriptions from scammers, but all of these can be extremely traumatic, of course. And again, particular risk if they live alone. So there are some kind of ways that people are already trying to deal with this, mainly if a carer lives in that kind of in the dwelling, they can then help prevent these or initiate call blocker, but beforehand people are particularly vulnerable. And again, if they don't have lasting power of attorney. Moving on to lasting power of attorney, what we're seeing kind of pick up some of the points earlier, these can help prevent a lot of issues when it is in place. And the kind of key issues are really that people are kind of putting this in place too late, or they maybe have it in place but it's not yet enacted. So I think you can have 2 choices when kind of putting in place a lasting power of attorney. And there's that grey area, and I think Nicola, it was a really interesting point that we were seeing, where actually people can be very vulnerable, no one's really checking it, and that's where a lot of risk can occur. So I won't go into this too much detail, but you know, key really distressing issues of people actually haven't put it in place and they lose capacity, extremely expensive and traumatic. We really want to avoid that. But also there's this grey area beforehand where what we're seeing is that some carers actually going through a number of risks to actually support their loved one because they're not actually able to do all the activities they need. So they might be getting cash out using their card, or having to pretend to be them over the phone to help them out because they feel like they're kind of lost at the moment, might not have lasting power of attorney, but they really need that support. And we see key barriers to putting this in place, misperceptions about how many people can be how many kind of family members can be a power of attorney, thinking it may restrict independence, so that might not entirely be a misperception. in practice, and a lack of awareness of the consequences. And the key issue is that flexibility as well. When it is in place, what we're seeing is, though the Mental Health Act, really talks about flexibility when it's actually in place. Some banks are actually kind of implementing it in quite an inflexible manner. Carers are finding extremely distressing. That was one of the most quotes I got on this issue. So this issue caused a lot of distress about how inefficient it is to put this in place. So I think that's kind of reinforcing Alex's point. And again, just some informal solutions, but I think there's a lot more to do in that space. Final kind of issues around kind of staff and public attitudes. So this can cause and affect a lot of the problems we were talking about earlier. And we're seeing many customer dementia might feel rushed, ignored, overwhelmed, or judged by staff. Sometimes staff want to do their best and might assume that it's better to speak to their carer, or when actually that can exacerbate issues and make someone feel very disrespected. Or maybe ask too many questions at the till or at the table, which can make someone feel very overwhelmed. We're seeing a huge lack of awareness, which can escalate dementia-driven incidents. So for instance, someone forgetting to pay. A lot of times in kind of some shops or we're seeing in terms of trains, for instance, traveling with train, sometimes staff are confusing abusive behavior with someone who has support needs, and that can cause significant issues. So that lack of understanding is key in that area. But there are a lot of kind of existing solutions already in place that could potentially be scaled up in terms of training, badges, lanyards, things like that, that may help. In terms of finance, we're seeing that there's a big issue about people not being put on kind of priority service registers, which can actually cause a lot of distress and be quite dangerous. And that could be kind of in terms of losing that data of that someone needs support, issues with training, things like that, but people not maybe wanting to disclose as well. So there are issues there. There's kind of inconsistent support, I think that was mentioned earlier, that we're seeing that some staff have that personal experience and others don't, and there's not kind of clear consistency across companies. In terms of kind of and public awareness, we're seeing kind of struggling to adhere to social etiquette can cause embarrassment for carers and people with dementia, that can then stop them doing the things they enjoy. So reactions can play a real part. So I'll just skip through these a little bit. I think this is an interesting point, is that what we're seeing is that if people do feel confident to share their support needs, this can actually reduce many of the issues that we talked about. So it could either be through badges, lanyards, a doctor's note disclosing their support needs at a bank. There are some banks actually allowing someone to kind of have a card that is scanned on the way in, which is really interesting. So that they can disclose it in a kind of less stigmatizing way or obvious way. Because some
Sophia,
people,
sorry, can you wrap up, because we do want to, there's loads
of
questions and we want to leave some time for that.
Yes. So sorry, just key point there is that if people are able to disclose their support needs, they can actually address some of those problems, but the issue is some of those methods can be seen as stigmatizing. There's some issues with design. I'll leave that and move on to the summary. So as we said, people struggle in terms of travel, buying what they want to need, feeling confident to make payments, feeling confident to manage their finances and sort them for future, and feeling understood and respected. And just super quick, there were some issues that we when mentioned around COVID. Two key issues there are people lacking confidence to go out and about because they feel that they've lost skills, so potentially losing their ability to use contactless, for instance, as an example, or socialize, and the fear of catching COVID. So they're two key kind of ongoing issues. Also seeing kind of some anxiety around the changing high street and layouts in that period. And we're seeing some key issues for carers and professionals. So carers, there's exhaustion and embarrassment to kind of supporting their loved one to remain independent, and that can often then restrict the loved one's independence. We see professionals, two big key issues: not being aware of their customer needs, but also encouraging customers to use support that they have available. That's a key gap there. So I'll end on this. Sorry, I spoke too much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophia. So thank you for the questions that have been coming into the chat. We've just got a few minutes left and hopefully we'll be able to address most of those. So the first question from Karen for Nicola around whether age discrimination is a legal factor for financial institutions and access to products. You're still on mute, Nicola.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, yes, and you know, there's always going to be a question about how financial institutions are going to manage both the communication of products and how they're going to ensure that it's marketed and got to everybody without sort of indirectly discriminating against anyone. I mean, I think it's I was interested by Sophia's presentation, because I think, you know, one of the stark issues is, of course, there are some people who aren't necessarily open and willing to be as supportive as they can be within the sort of the financial organizations and so on. But at the same time, I think the other reality is it's quite difficult to find that balance in making sure you're providing the support without sort of overstepping, because of course, you know, we have to be sort of cognizant of the fact that, you know, just because someone's got a diagnosis, or just because somebody's experiencing some sorts of problems, it doesn't necessarily mean we've got to start removing their sort of humanity, if you like, and their ability to make decisions. As we know, capacity is not, or incapacity is not a sort of you know, a blanket issue. It's something that is time and issue specific. So we've got to be careful about how we handle that. But I think, yeah, certainly in relation to the question, it's a legal factor that that ought to be taken into account and dealt with properly. But at the same time, how you manage that in a practical way, in an effective way, is much more trying, much more challenging.
Thank you very much. And then Karen's put a question to me about how can we today effectively campaign more for changes via MPs, or which organisations are best. I'll probably invite other members of the panel to comment on this as well, but I know that certainly organisations like Age UK are doing a lot of work around financial inclusion for older people. There is interest from MPs. There are all-party parliamentary groups that are interested in this issue, but I think that the financial services industry has a big role to play in this. Again, it is something that they are increasingly interested in, around a duty and a responsibility toward what they term as vulnerable customers. But I don't know if anyone else on the panel wants to comment here on this issue, but I think there are a number of different ways. But I certainly think the financial services industry presents a window of opportunity, I think, to try and make some change. Debbie, did you want to just follow up?
Yeah, I just want to say, I think that one of the big problems which policy, industry and banks and everybody else in this country hasn't really worked out what we should do about it is, how do you involve families appropriately in providing support, short of taking over someone's finances? Because all of those discussions end up really always mired in safeguarding issues. But an awful lot of family members are actually, you know, not a safeguarding risk. And we somehow, I think, you know, we're so anxious about the person who's going to steal pension from their mother, and of course those people exist, that we're kind of excluding a huge amount of community and family support that there potentially could be. And I think we haven't, you know, we're not having those discussions about how we get that balance better. I think it's completely wrong at the moment.
I mean, I would just add, I mean, I agree. I mean, I think on, you know, on the one hand, banks and financial institutions, you know, they're required by law to recognise their responsibility and give constructive notice. So that, you know, if somebody comes along who seems vulnerable, these institutions are expected to take the necessary steps to ensure they've got advice and support and all the rest of it. But actually, you know, I think it's very binary in a way. We expect financial institutions to respond. Either, you know, they do nothing, or they look at family members and anyone who appears to be there in a supportive fashion to the vulnerable person is going to be a threat. So I think from a financial institution's perspective, it can also be quite difficult to navigate how to do the right thing, given the fact that, you know, as I say, the law and sort of the broader environments tend to treat this issue in quite a binary polar fashion. It's quite difficult to sort of navigate that in practice.
I don't know if I could pick up on that point. Yeah, I just think it came a lot in the research, that kind of inflexibility. You know, you either have power of attorney or you kind of can't do anything. And it was interesting, there were a few financial professionals I spoke to that said in some cases they might do, for very low risk kind of transactions, maybe something where they allow their carer to, a person with dementia a customer with dementia to sign an agreement to say they're happy for their carer to kind of help them. Maybe that could be a simple transaction like, I don't know, getting a new bank card, which many carers at the moment can't help with before having lasting power of attorney. So I wonder if there's a move towards, you know, thinking of a more flexible solution beforehand and distinguishing between lower risk and more risky kind of financial transactions, things like that.
Okay, thank you very much. So Neil has posed a question about if you were a judge tasked with setting out the law on financial capacity, what would be the salient details people would need to comprehend? Quite a complex question. I think Debbie's answered that a little lower down in the chat. I'm just mindful of the time and I want to get a couple of the other questions in as well. Dean has mentioned about the role of human rights and EDI input into this. That is something that I will follow up with Dean. He is part of our advisory group, so I will follow up with Dean about that separately. Another question for Sophia about how can people prove their identity to HMRC and financial institutions if they don't have passport or driving license anymore, and some of the challenges around using the government gateway?
A really good question. I don't know the specifics myself in terms of having to try this, but just speaking to people about this, it does seem, you know, a really significant issue in terms of proving identity. If somebody moves house, that can cause significant issues. Some people won't update it. So definitely the process is quite complex at the moment. So yeah, I'm not sure exactly on the answer, but I think we do need to move towards making these processes as simple as possible. I think the shift to being able to kind of do the lasting power of attorney form online is a really good step, but I think there's more we could do to make all these processes a lot easier. And that's a good point. Someone with dementia might lose some of these forms of identification.
Thank you. Chris has put a question to
me.
Alex,
Chris has put really interesting questions.
Yeah.
Sorry, but it is 12 o'clock. So
I was going to say, I'm not sure.
I wondered if you just wanted to say something about his question about, do you think there's sufficient guidance out there given the complexity?
Yeah, I think,
and then maybe wrap up and say thanks to everybody.
I think that is an interesting question. I think there are a lot of resources and guidance that are available, but as I said, a lot of them are very process driven and focused, and I think they are missing the complexity and challenges of the emotional aspects, the fact that things don't always work as well as it looks like they might do within the guidance. So I think there's a need for perhaps some deeper guidance or guidance of a different type there. Quite what that is at the moment, I don't really know as yet, but I think it's a really interesting area. I think that is all we've got time for, I'm afraid. It is 12 o'clock, so thank you very much indeed for everybody's interest.
And we're happy to share the slides, I think, Alex, are we? Someone's asked.
Yes, I think we can make the slides available. The presentation will be made available on the one of the university's YouTube channels as well. So it will all be available there. So thank you very much indeed, everybody, for coming along. Yeah, we will end there. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so if you might stop sharing.
Oh, sorry, apologies.
We can all wave goodbye.
Thank you, everybody.